The great hall of Calder could seat 400 warriors, and on the night the beta decided to break her, nearly every one of them was watching. Wren kept to the shadow of the far pillars, where the servants moved, refilling cups and clearing bones from the long tables. She had learned that the trick to being invisible was not stillness. Stillness drew the eye. The trick was to move exactly like everyone expected. A tired maid, to move a little slow, a little bent, her gaze always a foot below anyone else's. She had spent 3 years perfecting it. She was very good at it now. Malric found her anyway. He was the king's beta, second only to the throne, and he wore that fact the way other men wore a heavy cloak, letting it drag behind him so everyone could see the weight of it. He had been drinking since the meat came out. When he rose from the high table and crossed the floor toward the servants' pillars, the hall quieted by degrees, the way a wood quiets when something large begins to hunt. "You?" he said. "The gray one. Come here." Wren came. She kept her eyes down. She let her shoulders round. "Pour," he said, and held out his cup, and she poured, and the wine went in without a ripple, a clean dark stream that stopped the instant he lifted the rim away. It was a small thing. It should have meant nothing. But Malric watched her hands as she did it, and something in his wine-slow mind snagged on the steadiness of them. "Do it again," he said. He tipped the cup out onto the rushes at her feet. "Clumsy. Look, you've spilled. Do it again." She poured again. Again it was clean. Again. By the 4th time the hall had understood that this was sport, and a low, ugly laughter had begun to move through it. And Malric was smiling the way a man smiles when he has found something small enough to be safe to hurt. He knocked the cup from her hand. It rang on the stone. He told her to pick it up, and when she reached for it, he set his boot down on the back of her hand and pressed, grinding her fingers against the cup and the cold stone. And he asked the hall whether they had ever seen a creature so useless that it could not even fetch a cup from the floor. Wren looked at the boot on her hand. She looked at the ankle above it and knew, without wanting to, exactly where a man that size would fold if a hand that knew its work found the spot. Before he understood he had been touched. She knew 40 ways to end him from where she knelt. She had taught most of them to better men than him, in a cold country. A long time ago, at the near end of the high table, an old warrior with a gray-shot beard had stopped laughing. He was leaning forward, frowning, his cup forgotten in his fist, and he was looking at the back of Wren's bowed head as though a word he had lost was sitting just behind his teeth. She felt his stare land, and she made herself smaller. "Well," Malric said. "Forgive me, my lord," Wren said, in the flat, soft voice she had built for exactly this. "I am clumsy. I will do better." She said it to the floor. She said it while 40 ways to kill him arranged themselves in her mind, and then, one by one, put themselves quietly away, because the day these warriors remembered her name was the day she died, and she had decided a long time ago that she would very much rather live. Malric lifted his boot. He had already lost interest, the way such men do. The moment a thing stops fighting back, he turned to go. At the top of the hall, in the tall carved chair that no one else was permitted to touch, the king of Caldar had set down his own cup, and he was watching the maid pick a dented vessel up off his floor, with hands that did not shake at all. He did not laugh. He had not laughed once. Wren rose and bowed and carried the ruined cup away into the dark behind the pillars, and did not let herself breathe out until she reached it. The old warrior with the gray-shot beard watched her go the whole way. They came for her the next morning, which she had not expected. She had expected, at worst, to be dismissed. A maid who drew the beta's eye and lost him his sport in front of 400 men was a maid who found her belongings in the yard by dawn, and Wren had a bag packed for that, a small one, always, under the 3rd floorboard from her window. Instead, a page in the king's colors knocked at the servants' hall and read her name off a slip of paper. the name she had chosen for herself, and said the king required her in the East Wing, and would she come at once. The head of household, a broad woman named Pearl, who had never once been kind to her, went white and then furious, as though Wren had arranged this herself as an insult. "What did you do?" Pearl hissed as she pushed her toward the corridor. "What did you say to him?" "Nothing," Wren said, which was true. The East Wing was the king's own. She had never been permitted past its doors. A maid of her rank cleaned the outer halls and the guest rooms, and the long, cold galleries where the old banners hung, and it was the banners she thought of now, following the page, because she knew what was kept in the East Wing, and she did not want to be near any of it. She kept her eyes down. She counted the turns from habit, mapping her way out, marking the doors, the windows low enough to take, the places a person could stand where two corridors met and see both. The page left her in a bright room with a cold hearth and a great table covered in maps, and the king of Kaldar turned from the window to look at her. He was younger than she had thought, seeing him close. Not young. There was gray coming in at his temples, and a seam of old scar that ran from the corner of his jaw down under his collar, the kind of scar a man got from a blade meant to open his throat that had been an inch too slow. But his eyes were clear and very steady, and they went over her once, top to bottom, not the way Malric's had, but the way she herself looked at a new recruit, measuring, weighing, seeing. She did not like being seen. Her whole life now was built on not being seen. "You are the one from last night," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "The one my beta made a fool of." "Your beta was in good spirits, Majesty," Wren said to the floor. "I bear him no complaint." "No," the king said, "you wouldn't." He came around the table. She kept her gaze down and watched his boots instead. Good boots, worn honestly. A soldier's boots and not a courtier's. "I have been trying to decide since last night," he went on, "how a person kneels on a stone floor with a man's boot on her hand and pours 4 cups of wine without spilling a drop. My own hands are steadier than most. I do not think I could have managed the 4th. Fear, Majesty," Wren said. "Fear makes a body careful." "Does it?" the king said. It was not a question. He was quiet a moment, and in the quiet she felt him do a thing she had not felt anyone do in 3 years. He drew a slow breath through his nose, the way wolves did, tasting the air of her, and she saw the faint pull of his brow, as something in her scent caught at the edge of a memory and would not come loose. She had spent every morning of 3 years crushing bittermint and grave ash under her tongue to smother exactly that. Her heart went very cold and very calm, the way it used to before a charge. "You will serve in this wing from today," the king said. "The night hours. My household here is small, and I want it smaller. I have too many people around me who talk, and last night I watched a woman say nothing at all under a great deal of provocation, and I found I preferred her to all of them." He looked at her. "Does that trouble you?" It troubled her more than anything had troubled her in years. To be here, in the one wing where her own history hung on the walls, under the eye of a wolf who could all but taste the truth of her, at the pleasure of a king who noticed things. Every instinct she had, and she had the instincts of a woman who had kept 800 soldiers alive in a country that wanted them dead, told her to refuse, to weep, to be dismissed, to be gone by dark. "It is a great honor, Majesty," she said. "I am not worthy of it. That," the king said, "is for me to decide." And he turned back to his maps, and she understood she had been given no choice at all. The page let her out. At the door of the East Wing, a captain of the king's own guard stood at his post, a hard, lean man with a hunter's stillness, and as she passed, he glanced at her. And then he glanced again. Longer the way a man does at a face he cannot place, and his hand drifted without his knowing it to the pommel of his sword. Wren walked on with her eyes down, and did not let her step change. But she knew the look. She had commanded men who wore it, It was the look of a soldier who has seen a ghost and does not yet believe in ghosts. Her name was not Wren. Her name was Sarah Vallon, and there had been a year of her life when men crossed themselves at the sound of it. They had called her the Grey Commander, for the wolf she carried, a great silver-gray beast the color of a winter sky, and for the gray cloak she wore, and for the gray country in the north where she had made her name holding a line that everyone with any sense had told her could not be held. She had held it for 2 winters. She had held it with 800 of the finest warriors the free wolf-holds ever put into the field, a war band called the Ashfang, and for 2 winters, the name Ashfang had meant that a thing thought impossible would be done anyway, and done by dawn. Then had come Duncarrow. And after Duncarrow, there had been no Ashfang, and no Grey Commander, and no Sarah Vallon. There had only been a woman crawling out of a frozen ravine with her wolf too broken to rise, into a world that had already agreed she was dead. She thought of it now, kneeling at the king's cold hearth in the black hours, laying the fire she was not truly needed to lay, because she had learned that a servant with idle hands invited conversation, and a servant always working did not. Duncarrow had not been a defeat. That was the thing the songs got wrong. On the rare occasions the songs mentioned it at all, it had been a murder. She had been ordered into the pass by the warlord who held her command's leash, a smiling southern lord named Castor, who had sent word that the enemy host was broken and fleeing, and that the Ashfang were to ride hard and finish them before the thaw. She had questioned the order. She had questioned it twice, in writing, because something in the shape of it had smelled wrong to her even at 100 miles. And then she had obeyed it, because that was what a commander did, and she had led 800 of her own into a pass where the enemy was not broken and not fleeing but waiting, 12,000 strong with the mouth of the valley closing behind them like a jaw. She had lost all of them, every one. She had watched the Ashfang die around her in the snow, while the relief that Castor had sworn was an hour behind them never came at all, because it had never been coming, because the whole thing had been built to happen exactly the way it happened. Castor had wanted her command, he had wanted her legend, or he had wanted it gone. In the end, he had taken both, and he had gone home a hero of the realm, with the blood of the Ashfang frozen into the ground behind him. And he had told the world that the Grey Commander had ridden her warband to slaughter through her own reckless pride. The world had believed him. Why would it not? He was a great lord with a smooth voice, and she was a corpse who could not answer. So she had let the corpse stay a corpse. She had gone south under a plain name into a realm where no one had cared about a far northern war, and she had made herself small and slow and gray in a way that had nothing to do with wolves. And she had lived. To reclaim her name, she would have to prove what Castor had done, and the only proof had died in the pass with the men who had seen it. To reclaim her name, she would have to let Castor know she still breathed, and the day he learned that would be the day he sent quieter men than soldiers to make certain she stopped. Her name was worth nothing to anyone now. Her silence was worth her life. It had seemed for 3 years a simple enough trade. It did not feel simple in the east wing of Caldor. The king came to his study in the black hours because he did not sleep, and she came because he had ordered it, and so a thing began between them that she had no name for and did not want. He would sit at the great map table with a single candle, turning over reports from the borders, and she would tend a fire that did not need tending, and at first they did not speak. Then one night he asked her, without looking up, whether she thought a garrison of 90 could hold a river ford against a raiding party of unknown number, and she said, before she had decided to say anything at all, that it depended entirely on the ford, and that 90 could hold almost anything for a day and almost nothing for a week, and that the only real question was whether help was a day away or a week away, and that he should not spend a single man until he knew which. The king put down his report and looked at her for a long time. That, he said slowly, is not a maid's answer. I had a father who soldiered Majesty, Ren said. I heard a great deal of it as a girl. The lie came smooth. She had built it years ago and kept it oiled. The king said, and picked his report back up. But she had felt the snag of his attention, catch and hold, and she cursed herself. And after that, she was more careful. It was not easy to be careful with him. He was clever, and he was tired. And tired, clever men reached for the company of anyone who could think. And she could think. It was the one thing she had never learned how to hide. She learned other things about him in those long nights. She learned that he had come to the throne late and sideways, after a brother, and that he had fought his own wars in his own north, and carried them the way she carried hers, close and quiet, and never spoken of. She learned that the court did not love him, that half of it had been built around men he did not trust, and that Malric, his own beta, watched the throne with a patience the king saw perfectly well and could not yet prove a reason to move against. And she learned, on the 5th night, why the ground under her had begun to shift. The realm has decided to remember its dead, the king said without warmth. A herald had come south, he told her, from the northern holds. In the spring there was to be a great gathering at Calder, a memorial 3 years late, for the fallen of the Northern War. Old warbands were being called in. Survivors were being sought out and honored. Lords who had fought in the north were to attend and be seen and lay their wreaths and remind everyone how brave they had been. Lord Castor himself has written to say he will come, the king said, and Ren, kneeling at the hearth with her back to him, felt every drop of blood in her body go still. You will not know the name, a hero of the north, they say. He led the campaign that broke the raiders, at a place called Duncaro. The king's voice held something dry and unconvinced that she was too frozen to properly hear. They are bringing me every soldier still living who stood in that country, he said, so that I might thank them in the sight of the gods. Every soldier still living who stood in that country. They were bringing them here, to this hall. To her. After that, the days had a clock in them, and the clock ran towards spring. The court had opinions about the king's grey maid, and none of them were kind. It was known now that she served in the East Wing at night, alone, at the king's own word, and there was only one thing a court like Calder's assumed such an arrangement to mean. The other servants, who had merely ignored her before, now ignored her with an edge, and the noblewomen who drifted through the outer galleries let their voices carry when she passed. Malric was the worst of them, and the most dangerous, because Malric had not forgotten the great hall, and Malric was a man who could not bear to be the one who had looked foolish. He had begun to watch her. She felt it, the way she had once felt scouts on a ridgeline, a pressure at the back of the neck with no source she could name. She would have been entirely alone in it, if not for Yvonne. Ivani was one of the seamstresses, a bright, quick woman a few years younger than Ren, with a warm laugh and 100 small kindnesses, and she attached herself to the grey maid with a determination that Ren, starved of any gentleness at all, did not have the strength to refuse. Ivan saved her bread when the kitchens closed early. Ivan sat with her in the low hours and talked, easily and endlessly, of nothing, and asked her questions, gentle ones, harmless ones, about where she was from and whether she had family and how she came to be so far south and what the king was truly like in the black hours. Ren answered none of them fully, and Yvonne never pressed, and only much later would Ren make herself remember how often the questions had circled back, patient as water, to the same two things: where she had come from, and what passed between her and the king. The device of it, the thing that undid her care night after night, was the king himself, and the deep of the night, and the way a man with no one to trust will talk to the one person he has decided cannot hurt him. He thought her safe. He thought her a maid with a soldiering father and a steady pair of hands, and a mind he could rest against without being watched or wanted or weighed. He did not know he was resting against the sharpest instrument in his own hall. And she, who had not been trusted with anything but a scrub brush in 3 years, found that his trust was the most dangerous thing anyone had ever handed her, because she did not want to put it down. One night, he asked her to look at the border reports with him, openly, as though she were an officer and not a servant, and she forgot herself for the better part of an hour, and moved his markers on the map with 2 fingers the way she had moved 10,000 men, and told him where his raiders would strike next and why, and she was right. And they both knew she was right, and when she looked up from the map, his eyes were on her and not on the country, and there was a question in them she could not afford for either of them to ask. "Who taught you to read ground like that?" the king said quietly. "My father, Majesty," Ren said. "Your father." He did not believe her. She could see that he did not believe her, and that he had decided for reasons of his own not to call it a lie tonight. "You didn't flinch," he said in the hall. "Malric put his boot on your hand in front of my whole court, and you did not flinch. Maids flinch. Everyone flinches. I have seen grown warriors flinch at less." He leaned back. "I have been trying to remember these 2 weeks, where I have met a person who does not flinch. There are not many of them. They are all of them soldiers, and most of them are dead." The fire cracked. Ren said nothing, because there was nothing she could say that was both true and safe, and she had long ago learned to choose safe. "Go and rest," the king said at last, and let her go, and she went, and her hands were not quite steady on the door, which frightened her more than anything else that night. He was not the only one working toward her. She learned that 3 nights later, in the servants' passage behind the buttery, where the walls were thin and sound carried, and she had learned every board that creaked. She heard Malric's voice, low, and she stopped in the dark and did not breathe. He was speaking to someone she could not see, and his voice had none of the lazy cruelty he wore in the hall. It was clipped and careful and entirely sober. "I know that face from somewhere," Malric was saying. "I have known it for weeks, and it is driving me to madness. She is no maid. Maids do not stand like that. Write to the northern holds. Write to Lord Castor's people before he travels. Tell them the king has taken up a grey woman with a soldier's hands, and no history that anyone can find. And ask them, very quietly, whether anyone in that cold country ever lost track of a woman who moves like a blade." A pause. The other voice murmured something Ren could not catch. "I do not care, that it is probably nothing," Malric said. "I forget a great many things. I have never once forgotten a face, and hers is coming back to me." She heard him move toward the passage mouth, and she pressed herself into the black recess beside the flower bins and made herself a part of the stone, the way she had made herself part of a frozen ravine while men with torches walked the rim above her, looking for the last of the ashfang to kill. "Sooner or later," Malric said almost to himself, passing so close she could smell the wine on him, "I will remember exactly who she is. And then we will see what the king's little grey pet is really worth." His footsteps faded. Ren stayed in the dark a long time after they were gone, her back against the cold stone, and understood that the clock had just begun to run a good deal faster than spring. Winter thinned. The snow on the courtyard stones turned to slush in the afternoons and froze again by dark, and every frozen dawn was one dawn closer to spring and to the muster and to Castor, and Ren counted them the way she had once counted her dwindling arrows on a wall that would not hold. And still she went to the east wing in the black hours, because he ordered it, and because she could no longer pretend to herself that the order was the only reason. The king had begun to talk to her the way soldiers talk to one another, in the dead middle of a campaign, when the fear has burned off and left only the truth. He told her things he told no one. He told her about his brother, the old king, who had been loud and beloved and reckless, and who had died in a border skirmish that need never have happened, and how the crown had come to a second son who had never been raised to want it and did not know how to make the court love him the way it had loved the first. He told her he suspected half his own council of taking Malric's coin. He told her once, very quietly, that he did not sleep, because when he closed his eyes he was back in his own northern war, in a burning steading with the screaming going on and on, and that he had never told another living soul that, and did not know why he was telling her. "Because I cannot hurt you," Ren said before she thought. "You have decided that, so it costs you nothing to say it aloud to me. That is all." The king looked at her, across the candle, for a long moment. "Is that what you think?" he said. "That it costs me nothing." She did not answer that. She had learned that some questions were pits with grass laid over them, and that the safe thing was to walk around and not across. There were warmer nights too, and those were worse, because they were harder to walk around. There was the night he showed her, without quite meaning to, the small gray token he carried, a wolf no larger than a thumb, carved by his brother when they were boys, worn smooth at the ears from a lifetime of a man's thumb passing over it in the dark. And there was the night. She made him laugh, truly laugh, over nothing. Over the pomposity of a visiting envoy she imitated without thinking, and the laugh was deep and startled and young, and it undid her more than any cruelty ever had. Because a person could steel herself against cruelty, and no one had ever taught her how to steel herself against being enjoyed. The court noticed. The court always noticed. And Malric, who had not forgotten anything, moved. He moved the proper way, which was the dangerous way. He did not touch her. He went to the king's own council and spoke, smoothly and with great regret, of the impropriety of an alpha king keeping an unknown woman of no birth and no history alone in his private wing through the hours of the night, of what the northern lords would say, when they rode south, and found the king of Kaldar so ruled by a servant's skirts. He asked, humbly, that the grey woman be sent back to the general household where she belonged, for the good of the king's own honor, and the king, in front of that whole council, said no. He said it flatly and without explaining himself, which was the one thing a king could do, that no one could argue with, and he held Malric's eyes while he said it, and Ren, who heard of it later from a kitchen boy who had heard it from a page, understood two things at once. She saw that the king had just put his own honor between her and the men who wanted her gone, and she understood that he had made himself look to a watching court exactly like the fool Malric had painted him, for the sake of a maid, and that every eye in Kaldar was now turned toward the grey woman in the east wing, which was the last thing in the world a hunted person could afford. He was protecting her, and in protecting her, he was drawing the hunt straight onto them both. She could not always find the edge of the pit in time. There was a night he could not settle at all, when a report from the northern border had come in wrong, and men he had sent were 3 days overdue, and he stood at the map with his fists on the table and his head down, and the great weight of it was pressing him into the floor. Without deciding to, Ren came and stood beside him and put her 2 fingers on the map and showed him, quietly, that the men were not lost, that the ground he was staring at had a fold in it that swallowed a day and a half of travel each way, that a rider in that country in this season would be 3 days late and perfectly alive, that he should hold his grief until he had earned it. And he turned his head and looked at her close, closer than they had ever stood. And she smelled the warmth of him under the grave ash she carried, and felt the pull of it in her own chest like a hook set behind the breastbone, and neither of them moved. "There it is again," the king said softly. "You do that, and for a moment I am certain of you, and then you fold yourself back into a maid, and I lose the thread." His eyes moved over her face. "Who are you, in the black hours? When you forget to be careful." She should have stepped back. 3 years of discipline stood at her shoulder and told her to step back. She stepped in. She did not decide it. Her body decided it, the starved and buried part of her that had not been touched, or wanted, or looked at as a person in 3 years, and she lifted her face to his and let her hand rest flat against his chest where the old scar ran under his collar, and for one breath, the whole cold, careful fortress of her simply fell. And the king caught her wrist gently, firmly, and held it still against him, and did not let it move, and did not pull her closer. "No," he said, "not like this." The word went through her like the poison she would later come to know. She stepped back, and her face was burning. and every instinct she owned was screaming at her that she had made herself known, made herself a fool, offered the one thing she had left to a man who did not want it, who had only ever wanted the clever tool and not the woman holding it. "Forgive me, Majesty," she said, and her flat maid's voice had come back, and she was grateful for it. "I forgot myself. It will not happen again." "That is not," the king began, and stopped, and she saw him choose his words the way she chose ground. "I will not take anything from a woman who is afraid of me." "And you are afraid, all the time, of something, and it is not me, and until you can tell me what it is, I will not have you reach for me in the dark, because you are frightened and I am there. You are worth more than that." He let go of her wrist. "You are worth a great deal more than that." She heard none of the second half. She heard only that he had not wanted her, and had wrapped the refusal in kindness the way a careful man wraps a blade before he hands it to a child, and she took the wrapped blade and she bowed and she left. In her narrow room under the eaves, she lifted the third floorboard from the window, and took out the small packed bag, and set it on the bed and looked at it for a long time. She would go before the thaw. She would go before Castor came, and Mulric remembered, and the king learned that the woman who had reached for him in the dark was a dead traitor, with the blood of 800 on her name. She would spare them both, the rest of it. She had spared herself, worse. She would be gone in 3 nights, 4 at the most, out the low window over the buttery roof and south again. And this time, she would not stop to let anyone be kind to her, because kindness, she saw now, was the one wall she had never learned to hold. She got as far as 3 nights. They came on the second. She had known distantly that they might. A woman who has been hunted learns the weather of it. And the weather in Kaldar had turned. Malric's letters had gone north weeks ago. Word came south, faster than lords could travel. Somewhere between the northern holds and the coming spring, someone with more to lose than Malric had ever had read a quiet report about a gray woman with a soldier's hands and no history that anyone could find, and had decided, as such men always decided, that a question was more dangerous alive than dead. She did not need to be proven to be the Grey Commander, she only needed to be possible. Possible was enough to be worth a knife in the dark. She was at the low window with the bag on her shoulder when she heard the board creak in the passage that had no reason to creak, the third from the stairhead, the one she had marked her first week in the palace out of a habit she had never been able to break. Wren set the bag down without a sound. Somewhere below her, the last discipline of 3 quiet years fell away, not with grief this time, but with something almost like relief, and the old cold readiness came up through her, like water filling a well. There were 3 of them, which told her someone had taken her seriously, and they were good, which told her the same, and they came through her door in the dark fast and low and spread, the way men come who have done this before and expect the thing in the room to scream and run. She did neither. She stepped inside the reach of the first, before he had crossed the sill, took his own knife from his own belt, and put him down with it before his hand had finished closing on the air where her throat should have been. She turned him, dying, into the second man and used the half-breath of his stumble to put the second man down hard and still beside the first. It was very quiet and very fast and entirely familiar, and some drowning part of her sang with the horror of how familiar it was, how easily the woman she had buried climbed back out of the ground the moment a blade was in her hand. She did not hear the 4th man, because there was no 4th man in the room. He was in the passage, and he had a crossbow, and it was not meant for the ones already dying. "Down," said a voice she knew, and a weight hit her from the side and took her off her feet, and the bolt that had been meant for the back of her skull took the King of Kaldar high between the shoulders instead, as he covered her body with his own. She felt him take it. She felt the whole of him lock and shudder against her, and she heard the sound he made, a short surprised grunt with something torn under it. And then they were both on the floor and he was heavy on top of her, and the last killer was already gone, footsteps hammering away down the passage into the dark of the palace, unpursued. Because she would not leave the man bleeding on her floor to chase him. No, Wren said. No, no, no. She got out from under him. She got a hand behind his head and eased him down onto his side. The bolt stood out of his back, below the shoulder, and the shaft where it met the wound was slick and dark and wrong. A wet blue-black sheen along the iron that no honest blood ever wore, and the smell of it reached her, and her stomach dropped through the floor of the world. She knew that smell. Every soldier of the North knew that smell. Silverwort, they had called it in the Ashfang, the wolf's bane, the coward's poison. The thing you smeared on a blade when you wanted to kill, not a man, but the wolf inside him, to sear the beast out of a shifter and leave whatever was left to fade slow and human, calling for a self that would not come. They had not meant it for a king, they had meant it for her, for the gray woman, to make certain that, whatever she was, she stayed dead this time. He had simply been in the way he had put himself in the way of everything, since the night she poured 4 clean cups of wine. "Stay with me," she said. "Corvin, stay with me. Do you hear me? You stubborn, you impossible man. Stay." His eyes found her. They were already going glassy at the edges, the poison working fast along the wound toward the deep hot core of him where the wolf lived, and he looked up at her, with the last clear thing left in him, and he did not ask why 3 men lay dead around them, at the hand of a maid. He looked at the bodies, he looked at her stance over him, at the knife reversed along her forearm the way no maid had ever held a knife, and something moved through his face that was not fear and was not even surprise. It was, of all the terrible things, recognition, as though he had suspected the whole of it for weeks and only now been shown that he was right. "There you are," he breathed, "in the black hours." And then his eyes rolled back, and the whole vast weight of him went slack in her arms, and boots were thundering in the passage, and the door filled with guards and torchlight, and Captain Roan stood in the doorway with his sword half drawn and looked at his king bleeding out on a servant's floor, and at the 3 dead killers lying in the shapes that trained hands leave them in, and at the gray maid kneeling in the middle of it all, with her enemy's blood to her elbows and her chin, for the first time in 3 years, lifted. No one in that doorway moved, and in the silence Wren understood that whatever else she had lost tonight, the small gray life she had built out of silence was already over. They tried to take her away from him, and they learned, quickly, that they could not. It was not a thing, she decided. It was a thing that simply happened, the way water finds the low ground. When the healer said, "The king must be moved," and the room cleared, and the servant questioned, Wren stood up off the floor and became someone else. And the someone else spoke, and the room obeyed her before it thought to wonder why a maid should be obeyed. "He is not to be moved onto his back," she said. "The bolt stays where it is until you have a physician who has drawn silverwort before, and you do not have one. So send to the war orders in the town. There will be an old field cutter there who fought in the north and has done this 100 times. Bring him, wake him, drag him if you must. No one touches the shaft, no one puts water on the wound, water spreads it. Get me clean cloth, get me fire, get me every jar of grave ash and bittermint in this palace, and do it now." She turned on the healer, who had gone the color of tallow. Now they ran, even Roan, after a long flat look that she felt land between her shoulder blades like a thrown knife, sent his men running. She knew he would keep the look. She knew that when the king was out of danger, if the king came out of danger, there would be Roan, and his questions, and the 3 dead men, laid out with the small, precise wounds that no frightened servant defending herself in the dark had ever left in her life. She had killed cleanly, and she had killed fast, and she had killed like exactly what she was, and a hunter had watched her do it. Later, there would be a reckoning for that. But the poison did not care about later, and she found, kneeling in the king's blood with the whole ruin of her hiding coming down around her, that neither did she. She had let a great many people die under her hands in the snow, because a lord she trusted had lied to her, and she had promised the ravine, crawling out of it 3 years ago, that she would never again stand still and keep herself safe and small while the wrong person died in front of her. She had broken that promise every single day since. Simply by staying hidden, she would not break it tonight. The field cutter came before dawn, an old brute of a man with the Northern War written in every scar on his forearms, and he took one look at the blue-black sheen on the shaft, and one look at the gray woman giving orders over his king, and he did not waste breath on either wonder or argument. He did as she said. Between the two of them, in the long red hours before the light, they cut the bolt free, and drew the silverword out of the king of Calderdrop by ruinous drop, and did not let him die. They could not, however, save his wolf. She knew it, before the field cutter said it. She had held wounded shifters in the north. She had learned the difference under her hands between a man whose wolf was raging up to heal him and a man whose wolf had gone to ground. And when at last the king lay clean and stitched and breathing in the thin light of morning, the thing under his skin that should have been fighting for him was silent. Not dead. She could feel it there when she laid her palm flat against his fevered back. A great banked warmth gone cold and far away, curled around the wound like a beast that has been beaten so badly it will not come when called, may never come when called again. The silverwort had done precisely what silverwort was made to do. It had not killed the Alpha King of Caldar. It had reached inside him and put out the fire that made him what he was, and left a man where a wolf king had been. An alpha who could not shift. A wolf king with no wolf to show his people, with the northern lords riding south within the month, and a court already hungry for a reason. She knew exactly what such a court would make of it. She had lived her whole second life on what courts made of things. He woke near midday, and the first word out of him, cracked and faint before he knew where he was or what had been done to him, was not a word for himself. "The maid," he said, his hand moved on the blanket, searching. "Blind. They came. They came for the maid. Is she? Did they? She is here?" Wren said, and took his searching hand in both of hers. "She is safe. You saved her, you great fool. Rest, now." His fingers closed weakly around hers, and his eyes found her face, and he knew her, all of her. She could see that he knew, and he was far too spent to say any of it, and instead of relief on his face there was only a terrible plain gladness that she was whole. And then it happened, the thing she had no name for. It came in through their joined hands. It came like heat through a wall, and it was not hers. She felt the deep, cold silence where his wolf had been, and the grinding animal wrongness of that emptiness, and under it his pain, and under the pain, undefended as a man asleep, she felt what he felt when he looked at her. Not the clever tool, not the useful stranger with the steady hands. Her. Whole and gray and lethal and hunted and, somehow, in the private country behind his eyes, already his, and glad past all sense and past all reason, that the bolt had found him and not her. And deep in her own chest, in the place she had walled off with grave ashen discipline, and 3 years of grief, something that had lain dead still since Duncarrow lifted its head, her wolf. Her silver, unmistakable, ruinous wolf. The wolf that would name her to any northerner who saw it in a single heartbeat. The wolf she had not let so much as stir since the ravine, stirred now. It reached, without her leave, across the fading warmth of their joined hands toward the cold silence in him, and it keened, low and grieving and glad, for a hurt that was not its own. She let go of his hand as though it had burned her, and stood and stepped back, her heart slamming against her ribs. The king had already slipped back under his face, turned toward the place where she had been. The feeling was gone with the contact, snuffed out like a pinched candle, but her wolf did not lie back down. It paced the walls of her, once, twice, wide awake for the first time in 3 years, and turned its gray face toward the sleeping king, and would not settle. And Wren stood in the cold, clean morning light, with her hand pressed hard over her mouth and understood, with a dread that ran deeper than anything Castor had ever put into her, that the single most dangerous thing in the whole of Kaldar was no longer the letters going north, or the Lord riding south, or the hunter with his questions waiting beyond the door. It was the thing that had just woken up inside her own skin and turned and recognized its mate. The king would not be parted from her, and so the question of what to do with the Grey Maid, who had killed 3 men, solved itself. Captain Roan had wanted her in irons. He had said so plainly, standing at the foot of the king's sickbed with the 3 dead assassins already cooling in the yard, and he had laid out the case the way a good hunter lays a trail, that no maid alive killed like that she had lied about her name and her history and her hands, that a woman who could do what she had done in that room was a woman who could have done a great many other things, and that the king owed it to his own throat to find out what before he slept another night under the same roof as her. The king, who could barely lift his head, had heard him out, and then he had said, in a voice that had nothing of the sickbed in it, "She is under my protection. You will not touch her, you will not question her. You will find me instead, the man who bought those 3, because he is still out there, and he is the one who put this hole in my back." And Roan, who was loyal to the marrow whatever else he was, had bowed and gone to do it, and had not stopped watching her for a single hour since. They took the king to Highfell, the old hunting lodge in the hills where his line had gone to ground for 6 generations, a half-ruined stone house at the end of a long climbing track, easy to hold and easy to see anyone coming. Rowan brought a dozen men he trusted and set them in a ring, and the field cutter came too, and Wren came because the king had said she would, and because her wolf, awake now and pacing, would not have let her do otherwise. The lodge was where she learned what she was going to have to do, though it took her most of a month to admit it. Because the king was not healing the way a king should. The wound in his back closed clean enough. But the wolf did not come back. Every morning he woke a little stronger in the arm, and a little more hollow behind the eyes, a great alpha reaching down inside himself for the thing that had answered him since boyhood, and finding only the cold place where it used to live. She watched him try to shift on the 3rd week alone in the pale dawn on the frozen grass, thinking no one saw, and she watched the change catch halfway and tear at him and fail, and she watched him kneel there in the frost, with his fists in the dirt and his shoulders shaking, and she knew that a wolf king who could not shift day in the eyes of every wolf he ruled, already a dead man walking. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She taught him to fight without it. She did not ask his leave. She simply came out the next dawn and put a practice blade in the frost beside his hand and said, "Get up. Your wolf is not coming today, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not ever. And if you spend the time you have left grieving for it, you will die. The first time a man like Malric decides to test you. So get up. You have a body and a mind, and I have never in my life met the man I could not teach to keep himself alive. Get up, Corvin." He looked up at her, wrecked and furious, and underneath it, drowning. "And what," he said, "would a maid know about that?" "Everything," she said. "Get up." And he got up. She trained him the way she had trained the raw ones in the north, patiently and without mercy, hour on hour, in the ruined yard, and slowly, the drowning man came back up into the light. She showed him how a smaller weight beats a larger one, how to make his height a wall and not a target, how to read the shoulders and not the eyes, how to end a thing in one motion, so that a man who could not call a wolf never needed to. He was quick, quicker than his size promised, and he learned the way clever men learn, all at once, and then forever. There came a raw afternoon 3 weeks in when he put her flat on her back in the frozen mud for the first time clean and fair, and stood over her astonished at himself, and she lay there, in the cold looking up at the open startled joy on his face, and laughed. He hauled her up by the wrist, and for a moment they stood too close, both breathing hard. the steam of it mingling between them, and neither of them let go. There were mornings she forgot entirely to be careful, because it was so good, so unbearably good, to be doing the one thing in the world she had ever truly been for, and to be doing it with him. Their hands met over the grip of a blade 100 times a day, and every single time the bond leaked its quiet heat between them. His focus, his stubbornness, and threaded all through it, a wanting he never spoke, and every time her silver wolf lifted its head and strained toward him, and every time she said nothing, though she saw in his face that he felt it too, and had decided, as she had, to be a coward about it a little longer. He asked her once, in the blue evening, both of them spent against the yard wall, watching their breath smoke. "You are going to tell me, eventually," he said, "who you are, what they took from you." He did not look at her. "I am not asking. I am only saying I know there is a name, and a wound the shape of a betrayal, and people in the ground you could not save. I know the look. I have worn it every morning of my life since my brother died." He turned the little gray wolf token over in his fingers. "When you are ready, not before. I have all the time in the world, Wren. It appears to be the one thing I have left in great supply." And Wren, who had not wept in 3 years, had to look very hard at the far hills for a while before she trusted her voice. "I was a soldier," she said at last, which was the most she had ever given anyone. "My people were destroyed, every one of them, by someone I trusted, someone who called it a great victory and made himself a hero on their bones. And I was blamed for it, and if I am ever known, the man who did it will finish what he started. That is all I can give you. It has to be all for your sake as much as mine." "Then it is enough," the king said quietly, and did not ask for the name, and reached over in the dark and closed his scarred hand once around hers, briefly, and let go. And she loved him so much in that moment that it frightened her more than any blade ever had. It was Rowan who broke the peace of Highfell on a hard, bright morning, at the very end of winter, riding up the track at a gallop with a face like a closing fist. He had found the man who bought the assassins. And he had found a good deal more than that. And the king had best come back to Calder at once, he said, because in his absence the whole board had been turned over, and the muster was in 6 days, and every great lord in the realm was already gathering in the king's own hall, and the one who had ordered the king shot in the back was going to be standing in it. Rowan laid it out that night in the lodge's cold main room, and it was worse than any of them had feared. The assassins had been casters. Rowan had traced the coin that bought them back through 3 hands to a factor who served the northern lord, and he had the man in a cell in Calder ready to say so before the king's face. Malric had known. Malric had done more than know. It was Malric's letters north, weeks of them, that had told Castor's people about the grey woman with the soldier's hands. And it was Malric who had left the low window over the buttery unbarred the night the killers came. In return, Rowan had learned Malric had been promised the thing he had wanted since he was old enough to want anything, which was the throne itself, with Castor's hand on his shoulder and Castor's coffers at his back. A puppet king, and the lord who worked him. It was a tidy little future, and the king's death had been the first stone laid for it. And there had been a third hand inside the palace, closer than either, feeding the household's every movement out through the seamstress's post. A bright, quick woman, a few years younger than Wren, with a warm laugh and 100 small kindnesses, and a great many gentle questions that had always, in the end, come back to the same 2 things, where the grey maid had come from. And what passed between her and the king? Ivan. Of course it had been Ivan. The one kindness Wren had allowed herself in 3 careful years, and it had been a hook the whole time, baited so gently, she had never once felt the barb, and she had swallowed it whole, because she had been so very hungry to be liked. "There is more," Rowan said. And he looked at Wren when he said it, and she knew that the hunter had finally run his quarry to her. "I did not understand why a great southern lord would spend so much to kill one grey maid in another king's house. A servant is cheap to be rid of. This was not cheap. So I asked what Lord Castor is afraid of, and I asked it of every northern man I could find in Calder for the muster. And the answer is always the same: he is afraid of a ghost. He turned the full weight of his stare on her. 3 years back, Lord Castor won the realm's love breaking the raiders at a place called Duncarrow, except the men who are actually in the north do not tell it the way the songs do. They say he threw the finest warband the freeholds ever raised into a closed pass and let it die, on purpose, to be rid of the commander who led it, because that commander was loved in a way a climbing lord can never abide, and because a dead legend cannot stand up and call a hero a liar. They say every soul of the Ashfang died in that snow, 800 of them. He paused. They say the commander died with them, a woman. They called her the Grey Commander for her wolf, which was silver, the exact color of a winter sky. The fire cracked. No one spoke. The king had gone very still in his chair, and he was not looking at Roan at all. He was looking at Wren, and she understood that he had known, or half known, for a long time, and had waited, as he had promised, for her to be ready. "So I will ask at once," Roan said, not unkindly. "Is there a reason, my lady, that a man who murdered 800 souls to bury one commander would spend a fortune to be certain a grey woman in Caldar stayed dead?" Wren looked at the king looked at Wren. And she found, at the very end of 3 years of silence, that she was too tired to hold it up any longer, and that she did not want to hold it up ever again, in front of this man who had waited so patiently and asked for nothing. "My name is Sarah Vallon," she said. "I commanded the Ashfang. Castor did not kill me at Duncarrow, though the gods know he tried, and he has spent 3 years hunting a rumor without once knowing it was me he was hunting. Now, he knows exactly who I am, and exactly where I have been standing." She met Rowan's eyes, and then the king's. "And now you all do too." She waited for the king to speak. When he did, it was the last thing she expected, and it broke her worse than any accusation could have. "Then you must not come back to Calder," he said. She stared at him. "Listen to me," the king said, and he leaned forward, and his voice was low and fast and terrible with tenderness. "Castor is in my hall, with half the great lords of the realm behind him, and a story they have believed for 3 years. I am a king who cannot shift, whom that same court is 3 days from setting aside for Malric. I cannot protect my own throat right now, Sarah, let alone yours. If you walk into that hall, he will name you a dead traitor risen from the snow, and it will be your word, a runaway maid's word, against a beloved hero of the realm, and he will have you taken and quietly killed before the moon turns. And there will be nothing I can do to stop it. So you will not come. Roan will give you coin, and the fastest horse in the north, and a name no letter can ever follow. And you will go. Tonight, and you will live. You were promised nothing here. You owe me nothing. You never once chose any of this. Let me give you the only thing I still can. Let me give you your life." And there it was. The one temptation that had never lost its teeth. To run. To be small and gray and alive. He was not offering her another man, the way she had half feared. He was offering her the ravine again, the frozen crawl toward a life without a name. And he was offering it out of love, which was the only thing in the world that could have made it hurt this much. "No," Wren said. "Sarah, no!" She stood. "I ran once. A lord I trusted told me to do the safe thing and obey, and I did. And 800 of my people paid for my good sense, and I have spent 3 years running from the sound they made. I am done running. If I run now, Castor keeps his lie and his love and his lords, and you lose your throne and most likely your life, and I spend whatever is left of mine, knowing I left one more good person in the snow, to save my own skin." Her voice shook and she let it shake. "The only thing that can undo what Castor built is the one thing he cannot survive. Me, alive, and known, and standing in the light where every man who ever served the Grey Commander can see my face. The moment I do that, I can never be a ghost again. He will always be able to find me because I will be a woman with a name in the world instead of a rumor in the snow. I know precisely what it costs. She looked at him. I am paying it anyway for you. So do not, Corvin, do not you dare ask me to be careful. Not tonight. The king looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face gave way, and it was not defeat. It was awe. I don't suppose I dare. They rode for Kaldar in the black hour before dawn, all of them together, toward the one hall in the realm where the Grey Commander's living face would end everything, one way or the other. The great hall of Kaldar could seat 400 warriors, and on the day the realm gathered to honor its dead, every seat was full, and Sarah Valen walked into it the way she had walked out of it once before, gray and unregarded, her eyes a foot below everyone else's. For now, she came in among the king's household, hooded, unremarked, while the hall roared its welcome to the man of the hour. Lord Castor stood at the high dais in cloth of silver, older than she remembered, and heavier, but with the same warm, easy smile she had watched give the order that killed her whole world, and the great lords of the realm stood thick around him like iron filings around a lodestone, and she saw at once how the ground lay. The way she had always been able to see how ground lay. The king had been given the small chair to the side, Castor had the floor. And Malric stood at Castor's shoulder, wearing the look of a man who has been promised something and is very sure of it, and she understood that this was not a memorial at all, it was a deposition, dressed as one. Before the day was out, a wolfless king would be thanked for his years of service, and gently set aside for the good of the realm, and Malric would kneel to a crown, and Castor would own the hand that wore it. They had even prepared the killing stroke. Castor raised his hands for silence and spoke, in that warm carrying voice she still heard in her worst dreams, of the sad necessity before them all, of a realm that could not in these dangerous times be held together by a king whose own wolf had abandoned him in his hour of need, of his own heavy and reluctant duty to see the throne of Kaldar made strong again. And the hall murmured, and shifted, and began, lord by lord, to turn its face away from the quiet man in the small chair, and not one of them moved to help him, because a king who cannot show his wolf has no friends in a hall full of wolves. Sarah Valen put back her hood and walked out into the center of the floor. "Before you set a king aside, my lords," she said, and her voice was not a maid's voice. It was the voice that had carried down a battle line into the teeth of a northern gale, that had turned a rout into a stand on a night when the whole world was ending, and it filled the great hall to the rafters and stopped 400 warriors where they sat. "You should first hear from someone who knows exactly what Lord Castor does to the people who become inconvenient to him." Castor turned, and she watched the color drain out of his face like wine out of a cracked cup, because he knew her. He knew her at once. He had last seen that face in the red snow of a closed pass 3 years gone, and he had spent every night since telling himself it was safely and certainly dead. "You?" he said. It came out of him before he could stop it, torn loose by pure animal shock, and it was all the confession the hall would ever need. "You died. I saw the pass. You died at Duncarrow." "No," said Sarah Valen. Into a silence you could have struck like a bell. "My war band died at Duncarrow. 800 of them. Because you sent me word that the enemy was broken and fleeing, and you ordered me into a pass where 12,000 stood waiting in the rocks, and the relief you swore on your name would follow an hour behind us never came. Because it was never coming. Because you did not send the Ashfang into that pass to win. You sent us in to die. You murdered the finest warriors the freeholds ever raised to be rid of one commander you could not command." She turned her back on him then, the deepest contempt one soldier can show another, and faced the ranked, hard old faces along the hall. The veterans of the Northern War brought south to be honored this day, and she found among them the gray-bearded warrior who had frowned at the back of her bowed head, and she looked straight at him. "You served in the North, sir. You have the look of it. Tell them, do you know me?" The old warrior was already on his feet. He had gone white to the very lips, and his voice cracked like a green branch in a fire. "Great Commander," he said. And then, because there is nothing on this earth so certain or so simple as a soldier who has just found something he had long ago given up for dead, he shifted where he stood into an old gray werewolf missing half an ear, and he put that wolf down on its belly on the cold flagstones of the great hall and laid its head between its paws. The salute the freeholds gave to one commander, and to no other in all the world. It moved through the hall like fire through dry summer grass. Another man surged up from a bench, a scarred captain from a southern lord's retinue, and she watched the whole northern war come flooding back into his eyes, and he shifted and went down. Then a knot of them along the east wall, 3, 4, then a dozen, then more than she could count. Then Rowan himself at the great door, Rowan, who a month ago had wanted her in irons, lowering himself to one knee with his mailed fist pressed hard over his heart. All through the great hall of Calder, the finest warriors in the realm were rising to their feet and then sinking down, wolf after gray and brown and black wolf folding to the stone, lords' men and kings' men and free northern veterans alike, and the sound of it was like a great slow tide going out. And every last one of them had turned toward the gray woman, standing alone in the middle of the floor, their commander, come back to them out of 3 years of snow. Castor's lie died in that sound. You cannot execute a ghost that 400 living warriors have just knelt to with tears on their faces. His factor was brought weeping into the hall to name the coin and the hands it had passed through, and Malric, feeling the ground finally open beneath his feet, did the one thing left to a cornered coward and reached for his blade. And Sira Valin crossed the space between them and took the blade off him and put him down hard on the flagstones with his own arm bent wrong beneath him before the nearest guard had so much as finished drawing breath. Castor she did not touch. Castor she left kneeling for the king's justice, and the king of Caldar rose from the small chair to give it, and he did not look small any longer, and no one in that hall would ever again make the mistake of thinking he was. When it was done, when the guards had taken the pair of them away, and the whole hall hung on one held breath, Sira Valin turned to face the king, and made in front of every soul who would ever tell the story the choice she had come there to make. Because she saw it now, clearly, the shape of everything that was being laid at her feet. She was the great commander, returned from the dead. The northern lords were already looking at her, the way men look at a banner they mean to follow into any fire there is. She could have a command again, an army, a name, a place in the world, as high as she had the nerve to climb toward, and she had never in her life lacked for nerve. She did not need a wolfless king on a throne that had nearly been pulled out from under him. Any lord in that hall would have told her so, and counted himself wise for it. She crossed the floor to him instead. She took his scarred hand in both of hers, in the sight of the whole assembled realm, and she went down on one knee before the king, who could not shift. "I served a lord once, who was everything a lord is supposed to look like," she said, and she pitched it to carry to the farthest wall, fine and smiling and beloved. "And he left my people in the snow to make himself a song. And I have served a man these long winter months, who cannot show his wolf, who took a coward's bolt in the back for the sake of a maid he owed nothing at all, and who, when he learned the whole truth of me, tried to send me away to save my life, though it would have cost him his throne and his own to keep me by him." She looked up into his face. "I have had a long time to learn the difference between the two. I know which of them is a king. I choose him, not the crown, and not the wolf, and not one single thing he can give me. Him. If he will have a dead woman with a great deal of blood on her name." And the bond, which had leaked between them for months through every accidental brush of their hands, went through them both at once, like a struck bell rung true, no longer a small stolen leak, but a flood with nothing left holding it back. and she felt his whole heart open into hers, with not one corner of it held in reserve. And, deep in the cold and silent place inside him, where his wolf had lain beaten and dark for a whole winter, something drew a long, slow, shuddering breath and stirred and began to wake. "I will have you," the king said, and pulled her up off her knee and into him. "Grey Commander, I will have you. If the whole sky falls in on us both." The sky did not fall. But somewhere, deep under his ribs, faint and far off, and growing steadier with every beat of her heart against his, a wolf that a coward's poison had snuffed cold had quietly, without any leave from anyone, begun to burn again. They held the muster again in the spring, properly this time, the memorial that the reckoning with Castor had swallowed whole, and this time the Ashfang were named aloud, all 800 of them, one after another, in the great hall, until the reading of them took the better part of a day, by a commander who had finally been given back the right to grieve her people in the open light instead of alone in the dark. She wept through most of it, and was not ashamed, and the king stood at her side through every name, and did not once let go of her hand. Castor did not live to see it. His lie had cost him his lands, his name, and in the end, his life, and the realm that had spent 3 years loving him, learned to hate the very sound of him with the speed that only a betrayed crowd can ever manage. Malric lived, which proved to be its own long punishment. He was stripped of rank and title and place, and set to the lowest work in the household he had once lorded over from the high table, and there was a fine hard justice waiting in the cold morning, when Sarah Vallon passed through the great hall and found the man who had ground a cup under his boot on the back of her hand, down on his knees on those same cold flagstones with a scrubbing brush in his fist. Neither of them said a single word. Both of them understood everything there was to understand. She walked on, and left him to his floor. The King of Kaldar walked into the spring muster on his own 2 feet, unbowed and unhurried, and when the moment came, in front of the whole gathered realm, he threw back his head and shifted, whole and entire, into a great dark wolf that had come back to him slowly across the turning of the year, breath by breath, and beat by beat. Called home out of the dark, by a bond that a coward's poison had never once thought to count on, a startled roar of joy went up from the length of the hall at the sight of their Alpha King restored to himself. He let it ring on, and then he turned and paced across the stone to the silver wolf standing waiting at his side, the exact gray of a winter sky, the gray commander of the freeholds come back from the dead, his mate and his queen. And the 2 of them stood together in the center of the floor, where every soul in the realm could look on them and remember they had each of them been left for dead in the snow by the very people who should have kept them safe. A brother's careless little war, a smiling lord's patient treachery. And out of all the wreckage of that, out of a hall where one of them had once knelt with a boot on her hand, while the other sat small and forgotten in a borrowed chair, they had found the single thing that neither betrayal had ever managed to take from them. They had chosen freely and with their eyes open, when no living soul was making them do it, to keep each other. And in the end, that turned out to be worth more than a crown, or a wolf, or the finest name in any song ever sung in the North. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this one. Here is my question for you. Do you think Sarah was right to stay hidden all those years to keep herself alive? Or should she have risked everything to clear her name from the very start? Tell me down in the comments. I always love reading your thoughts, and I will see you very soon for another story.